Types of contract. Under the Indian Contract Act, 1872, contracts are classified into different types to understand their nature, validity, formation, and performance. These classifications are important for LLB exams and help in clear legal understanding. Based on validity. On the basis of validity, contracts may be valid, void, voidable, illegal, or unenforceable. Valid contract. A valid contract is a contract that is legally enforceable and fulfills all the essential elements laid down under the Indian Contract Act, 1872. Such a contract creates binding legal rights and obligations between the parties. For a contract to be valid, it must have a lawful offer and acceptance, free consent of the parties, lawful consideration and lawful object, competent parties, certainty of terms and possibility of performance, intention to create legal relations. If all these conditions are satisfied, the agreement becomes a valid contract and can be enforced in a court of law. Void contract. A void contract is a contract which is not enforceable by law. According to the Indian Contract Act, 1872, a contract becomes void when it ceases to be legally binding. A contract may be void from the very beginning or may become void later due to certain reasons such as impossibility of performance, change in law, or loss of subject matter. Void contracts do not create any legal rights or obligations between the parties, and no party can enforce such a contract in a court of law. Thus, a void contract has no legal effect and is not recognized or enforced by law. Example: an agreement to perform an impossible act, such as bringing a dead person back to life, is a void contract. Voidable contract. A voidable contract is a contract which is valid and enforceable at the option of one party, but not at the option of the other. This usually happens when the consent of one party is not free. Under the Indian Contract Act, 1872, a contract becomes voidable when consent is caused by coercion, undue influence, fraud, or misrepresentation. The aggrieved party has the right to either accept or reject the contract. If he chooses to cancel it, the contract becomes void. If he accepts it, the contract remains valid. Example: if A is forced by B to sign an agreement under threat, the contract is voidable at the option of A. Thus, a voidable contract protects the interests of the party whose consent was not freely given. Illegal contract. An illegal contract is a contract whose object or consideration is unlawful and expressly forbidden by law. Such contracts are void from the very beginning, void ab initio, under the Indian Contract Act, 1872. An illegal contract is not only unenforceable, but it also taints all related or collateral agreements, making them void as well. Courts will not provide any legal remedy to parties involved in an illegal contract, as it is against law and public policy. Example: if A agrees to pay B money to commit a crime, the agreement is an illegal contract. Thus, an illegal contract has no legal validity and is strictly prohibited by law. Unenforceable contract. An unenforceable contract is valid in substance but cannot be enforced due to technical defects such as lack of stamp or written form. An unenforceable contract is a contract which is valid in nature but cannot be enforced in a court of law due to certain technical defects. Such defects may include absence of required written form, lack of proper stamp, failure to comply with legal formalities. The contract itself is not illegal or void, but the court cannot enforce it until the defect is removed. Example: an agreement that is required to be in writing and registered but is only made orally may become an unenforceable contract. Thus, an unenforceable contract is valid in substance but fails to meet legal requirements for enforcement. Based on formation. On the basis of formation, contracts are of three types: express, implied, and quasi-contracts. Express contract. An express contract is a contract in which the terms of the agreement are clearly stated by the parties, either in writing or by spoken words. In an express contract, both the offer and acceptance are made in clear and definite terms, leaving no confusion about the rights and obligations of the parties. Such contracts are easy to understand and enforce because the intentions of the parties are clearly expressed. Example: if A agrees in writing to sell his house to B for 50 Indian rupees lakhs, or orally agrees to sell his bike to B for 10,000 Indian rupees, it is an express contract. Thus, an express contract is one where the agreement is clearly communicated in words, making it legally binding and enforceable. Implied contract. An implied contract is a contract which is not made by words, but is inferred from the conduct, behavior, or circumstances of the parties. In such contracts, the intention of the parties is understood from their actions rather than spoken or written terms. The law assumes that the parties intended to enter into a contract. Example: when a person travels in a bus and pays the fare, an implied contract arises between the passenger and the bus operator. Thus, an implied contract is formed by conduct and mutual understanding, and it is equally binding and enforceable under law. Quasi-contract. A quasi-contract is not a real contract, but an obligation imposed by law to prevent unjust enrichment of one person at the expense of another. In a quasi-contract, there is no offer, acceptance, or agreement between the parties. However, the law treats the situation as if a contract exists, in order to ensure fairness and justice. Quasi-contracts are recognized under the Indian Contract Act, 1872, especially in cases where one party has received a benefit unfairly. Example: if A mistakenly pays money to B, B is legally bound to return it. This obligation arises under quasi-contract. Thus, a quasi-contract is based on principles of equity and justice, and it prevents unjust benefit even without a formal agreement. Based on performance. On the basis of performance, contracts may be executed, executory, or partly executed and partly executory. Executed contract. An executed contract is a contract in which both parties have completely performed their obligations under the agreement. In such a contract, nothing remains to be done by either party. The promises made by both sides have already been fulfilled, and therefore, the contract is fully completed. Example: if A sells goods to B and B pays the full price at the same time, the contract is an executed contract. Thus, an executed contract is a fully performed contract, where no further legal obligations remain between the parties. Executory contract. An executory contract is a contract in which both parties have yet to perform their obligations, either fully or partially. In such a contract, the promises are to be performed at a future date, and the rights and duties of the parties are still outstanding. Example: if A agrees to sell his house to B after 1 month and B agrees to pay the price at that time, the contract is an executory contract until performance is completed. Thus, an executory contract is one where performance is still pending, and obligations are to be fulfilled in the future. Partly executed and partly executory contract. A partly executed and partly executory contract is a contract in which one party has already performed his obligation, while the other party's performance is still pending. In this type of contract, the contract is executed for one party and executory for the other. Example: if A sells goods to B and delivers the goods immediately, but B agrees to pay the price after 1 month, the contract is partly executed by A and partly executory by B. Thus, a partly executed and partly executory contract exists when performance is complete on one side and incomplete on the other side. Based on obligation. On the basis of obligation, contracts may be unilateral or bilateral. Unilateral contract. A unilateral contract is a contract in which only one party has to perform his promise, while the other party has already performed his part or is not required to perform any obligation. In such a contract, the obligation exists on one side only. The contract becomes complete when the required act is performed. Example: A offers a reward of 5,000 Indian rupees to anyone who finds and returns his lost dog. When a person finds and returns the dog, a unilateral contract is formed. Thus, a unilateral contract is characterized by one-sided obligation, where performance is required from only one party. Bilateral contract. A bilateral contract is a contract in which both parties have to perform their respective promises. In this type of contract, mutual obligations exist on both sides. Each party is both a promissor and a promisee. Most contracts in daily life, especially commercial contracts, are bilateral in nature. Example: if A agrees to sell his car to B for $300,000 and B agrees to pay the price, both parties have obligations. This is a bilateral contract. Thus, a bilateral contract involves reciprocal promises and creates duties and rights for both parties. Conclusion. In conclusion, the types of contracts under the Indian Contract Act, 1872 help in understanding the nature, validity, formation, and performance of agreements. Contracts may be valid, void, voidable, illegal, or unenforceable, express, implied, or quasi, executed, executory, or partly executed, and unilateral or bilateral. This classification is very useful for LLB examinations and practical application of law, as it clearly explains when a contract is enforceable and what legal effect it produces.